Welcome back. Before anything else, I want you to hold something. Not tightly, not the way you hold something you're afraid of losing. More the way you carry a stone in your coat pocket and keep touching it without meaning to, without even noticing until your hand is already there. Just hold it. Kronos was not the god of time. That's the thing. That's the stone. The world will tell you otherwise, has been telling you otherwise, probably in that confident, half-remembered way that certain facts accumulate over a life, somewhere between a documentary and a dinner conversation, somewhere between a textbook caption and a tattoo you saw on someone's forearm on the train. They say it like it's settled. And I understand the appeal. The scythe, the hourglass, the old man with the white beard eating. It fits. It cohere into something you can point at and say, there, that's what that god is about. Time, endings, the whole pageant. But the picture was assembled wrong. Someone looked at two names that sound almost identical and decided they were the same name. And then enough centuries passed that the mistake calcified into truth. And here we are. Kronos, with the H, and the ancient Greeks were clear about this. They noticed the difference even when everyone after them stopped. Kronos was time. The abstract machinery of it. The forward motion that doesn't care whether you're watching. Kronos, without that H in the original, was something else. Older in certain ways. More intimate, which is not the word you'd expect, but I think it's the right one. He was the harvest god, the Sickle, the god of the exact moment when something that has grown to its full height is cut away from the ground that made it. The moment time arrives at. That's how I want to say it. He wasn't time itself. He was what time was building toward. There's a kind of knowledge in that. You can't fake it. You have to know, actually know, from some deep accumulation of watching and waiting. When the grain is ready, too soon and you've ruined it, cut it while it still had somewhere to go. Too late and it falls and rots and the earth takes it back and the cycle closes without you having gotten anything out of it. The skill is the timing. The wisdom is knowing when the moment has arrived without anyone having to tell you. That is the God we're talking about tonight. And I want to tell you the whole thing, the full version. I am tired, if I'm being honest, of versions of this story that treat Kronos as setup, as prologue, as the villain who has to lose so the interesting gods can get started. He was not warm-up. What happened to him and what he did and what he built and what it cost him, that is a complete story. One of the oldest ones, and it goes all the way down. So let your body do what it does without your help. The breathing, the heartbeat, the small, continuous labor of being alive. Let it run on its own. Let your mind come somewhere else. Let the story begin. Before Kronos, before gods, before anything that earns the word story, there was what the Greeks called chaos. And already I have to slow down because the word has been through so much since then. We use it now to mean noise, disorder, the feeling of a day where nothing lines up and your keys are in 3 different places. That's not what they meant. The Greek chaos, different spelling, different sound at the root, means the void, the open mouth, the yawning. A gap so total, it precedes even the concept of gap, because a gap implies 2 edges, and there were no edges, no shapes, nothing to have an outside or an inside. darkness is the wrong word too, because darkness needs light to define itself against, and light had not yet arrived. Silence is wrong for the same reason. Chaos was before the before had any meaning at all. And then something changed. I struggle to say how to describe the next part without sounding like I'm reading from something. It doesn't happen mechanically. It doesn't happen through cause and effect. Those are tools that come later. Tools that need time and sequence to function, and neither existed yet. What happens is that Gaia appears, the Earth. She presses herself into existence. I keep coming back to that phrase, and I'm not totally sure why. Whether it's right, or just the closest I can get. She presses herself into existence through something that looks from the outside like will, although will might not be the right word either, since will usually implies something doing the willing, and there was no prior Gaia to do the willing. She just becomes. She is the first persistent thing, the first thing that stays. You can feel her right now. Whatever is underneath you, the chair, the floor, the bed, the ground several stories below a floor, the pull that holds you to it. That pull is older than anything else in this story and will outlast everything that happens in it. Gaia was here first, and she will be here after. And the story of Kronos is, in ways I'll keep returning to, her story. From chaos also came Tartarus. Not, this is important, not the underworld of the later mythology, not the place of shades and rivers and the cool, professional administration of Hades. Tartarus was below that, below, the abyss under the abyss, the place so far down that even gods who had lost everything still had somewhere further to fall. And from chaos came Eros. But again, careful. This is not the small archer with his comedy arrows and his divine matchmaking operation. This is Eros as a structural principle, gravity between things, the hunger everything has to be near another thing, the force that makes the universe trend toward contact rather than infinite isolated floating. Without it, there is only the void. With it, there is a world. Gaia came first. Uranus came from her, alone, which the mythology does not linger on, but I think is worth noting, because she did it without a counterpart, generated the sky through some act that the texts gesture toward without explaining, and the sky rose from her and spread over her and lay flat against her, and the contact was total. There was no space. Nothing could exist between them, no gap where any other life could start. Earth and sky pressed together, complete, sealed. And I keep thinking about how that begins as tenderness, how that contact starts as love in its most expansive form, before love has learned the difference between holding and keeping. It doesn't start cruel, but total possession has a way of arriving at cruelty without anyone deciding to go there. They loved each other the way the earth and the sky love each other. Children came from it, enormous children, 12 of them, the Titans, and that word still carries weight at the bottom of language if you press on it. These were not the gods you know. They were forces, cosmic principles wearing shapes, the laws that organize the universe, given names. Let me just list them plainly. Oceanus and Tethys, the ocean and its motion. The water that has no shore, it truly calls its own. They were the first functional marriage in the whole story, the oldest, the least dramatic. They don't show up in the violence. They don't take sides in the wars. They just flow. their children numbered in the thousands. Every river, every spring, every current was theirs, which means the water you drink is, in the old understanding, their descendant. I find them quietly remarkable, and I know the narrative doesn't spend much time here, but I could spend more. Anyway, Hyperion and Thea, light in different forms, the sun that burns and the brightness that isn't quite the sun, the shimmer of gold and gems and clear water. Their children would become the sun god and the moon goddess and the dawn, which means every morning you have ever seen coming, that specific grey-pink moment before the color comes in, that is theirs. Coeus and Phoebe, intelligence and prophecy, knowing and knowing what comes next. They were the grandparents of Hecate, who is a story for another night, and of Leto, who would become the mother of Apollo and Artemis, which means the two sharpest gods in the whole later pantheon trace their lineage through this pair, through thinking and through seeing. Mnemosyne, memory. She was a Titan by herself, no listed consort among the 12, and she matters later. She mattered so much to the Greeks that she became the mother of all the muses, which means that every song ever written, every painting, every poem, everything that human beings have ever made to try to hold onto time and experience, all of it descends from the Titan who was memory. I find this almost too neat to be comfortable with, but there it is, Themis, order, law, the principle that things should be a certain way. She would later sit beside Zeus as his counselor, which is a detail the myths don't always emphasize, but which I think matters. The new king needed the old order to tell him how to be a king. Cronos, he governs the south, or the stars, or the constellations, depending on which source you're reading. He is the least narrated of the 12, and I'll be honest, I'm not sure what to do with him. He exists. He is a Titan. He has a name and a domain, and I have given him one paragraph. Iapetus, the one the later myths remember, because his children would be Prometheus and Epimetheus and Atlas, which means, think about it, the god who gave humanity fire, the god who carries the world on his shoulders. They are grandchildren of Gaia and Uranus, grandchildren of earth and sky. The story keeps folding back on itself. And Kronos, the youngest, the one we came here for. The Greeks sometimes said he was Gaia's favorite, which might be projection on their part, or might be the mythology's way of saying the last child born into a bad situation carries more of the parents' grief than the ones who came before. Kronos arrived into a world where his father had decided that none of his children should exist in it. I need to pause here. Let me collect the thread, because this is the part that everything else depends on. Uranus hated his children, feared them, probably, though the texts don't always make space for the fathers in these stories to admit to fear. So it gets recorded as hate, gets recorded as revulsion. The Titans described as monstrous, too large, too strange, wrong somehow. But the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchyes, the other children, the ones born alongside the Titans and before them, they were extraordinary in ways that perhaps a sky god who thought of himself as the ceiling of everything might find disturbing. The Cyclopes made things. They had the eye, singular, and the hands, and the knowledge of fire and metal. The Hecatonchyes had 100 hands each, 50 heads, the strength that comes with that. Uranus looked at what he and Gaia had made, and he felt something that became action. He took them. He shoved them back, into Gaia, into Tartarus, into the earth he had come from, which is a detail the mythology skates past, but which, if you hold it for a second, is almost beyond comprehension. He pressed his children back into his wife's body and kept them there. Gaia suffered. That's stated plainly in the sources. The weight of children she could not birth, trapped inside her, straining at the inside of the earth, she suffered, and she made a plan. She shaped flint or adamantine or grey iron, depending on the version, into a sickle, the first sickle, the curve of the blade that would become her youngest son's symbol for the rest of mythological time. And she went to her children, the ones still inside her, and she said, "Who will do this? Who will take this?" Nobody wanted it. The texts say the Titans were afraid, and maybe they were. Or maybe, I'm speculating here, which I think I'm allowed to do. The sources leave room. Maybe it wasn't fear exactly. Maybe it was that none of them wanted to be the one who did the thing to the father, who decided the cycle ended here. Kronos took the sickle, the youngest, the favorite maybe. He took it and he waited. That night Uranus came down to Gaia, the way he came every night, the sky settling over the earth in that old totalizing contact. And Kronos reached out, and the sickle moved, and what was cut away, what Uranus lost in that moment, fell into the sea, and from the foam that gathered around it, eventually Aphrodite would be born, which is a detail so strange, I keep expecting someone to tell me I have it wrong. But that's the story, the love goddess, born from what the sky god lost when his own son finally said, "Enough." Kronos threw the rest into Tartarus, into the deep below the deep, and Uranus, bleeding, retreating back up into the sky, cursed his son, called him. The translations vary, but the essence is a tyrant, something that bends things wrong. And he said, as fathers in these stories always say, because the myths are interested in cycles the way some people are interested in wounds. Your children will do to you what you have done to me. Kronos heard this, and he became king. The age that followed, the Golden Age they called it, and the Greeks were not being casual about the name, was, by most accounts, genuinely good. Humans lived without toil. The earth gave what they needed without being asked too hard. Nobody was sick in any of the ways that would later seem ordinary. No war, the sources say, or at least no war among humans, which is a distinction that might say more about what the Greeks considered war than about the actual texture of daily life in the mythological past. But still, the image is of ease, of a world that had not yet learned deprivation. Kronos ruled it, and he was, you have to say this even though the story ends badly, he was the king who made it possible. The golden world existed under him, but the curse had teeth. He married his sister Rhea, which in the mythology carries no special weight. The Titans all married siblings. That was simply how the first generation worked. And Rhea was the great mother, the mountain mother, the one the later mystery cults would venerate. She was not small, she was not background, she was... I keep wanting to call her the real protagonist of this section of the story, but I know the story isn't organized around that framing. So I'll just say it here and move on. Rhea was the one who ended it, not Zeus. Rhea. But before the ending, there was the swallowing. Kronos had heard his father's curse, had held it the way you hold a thing you cannot put down, cannot stop touching, the way the thought comes back no matter how many other thoughts you try to fill the space with. His children would do to him what he had done to Uranus. His children would overthrow him. So he swallowed them. Hestia first, then Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, each one, as Rhea gave birth, taken immediately. Kronos swallowing his children whole, keeping them inside him the way his father had kept the Titans inside the earth. The cycle completing itself with a terrible mechanical accuracy that the mythology does not seem to find ironic, and maybe shouldn't. Because maybe it isn't irony. Maybe it's just how power works when it has been frightened. The children were alive inside him. That's specified, not digested, not destroyed. Alive in the dark of their father's body, which is, I don't know what to call that. I don't have a clean word for it. Something between imprisonment and gestation. Something the mythology had to invent for itself because there was no prior category. Rhea watched this happen 5 times. 5 children, born and gone. And when she was pregnant with the 6th, she went to Gaia, her mother, the earth. Gaia told her what to do. Rhea went to Crete. She gave birth alone, or nearly, in a cave on a mountain. The child was Zeus, and instead of giving Kronos his son, she wrapped a stone the size of a baby, wrapped in swaddling cloth, and she handed it to her husband, and he swallowed it. He swallowed a rock without noticing the difference. Zeus grew up in Crete. There's a whole apparatus of myth around his childhood. The goat who nursed him, the curettes who danced and clashed their shields to cover the sound of his crying, the honey and the wild bees. I am moving through this quickly because the childhood is prologue to the war, and the war is what we need. But the childhood happened. Zeus grew, and at some point, grown now, a god in his own right, dangerous. He came back. He disguised himself as a cupbearer in some versions. He gave Kronos something, a drink, an emetic, something that reversed what had been held, and Kronos vomited. His children came back out in the order they'd gone in, or reverse order. The details vary. The stone came out first or last. It landed at Delphi eventually. The naval stone, the Greeks would call it, the center of the world. His siblings came back into the world, and they were furious, and they were whole, and the war that followed lasted 10 years, which I think the mythology means as a way of saying it was not quick, it was not easy, nothing about it was clean. The Titans on one side, the children of Kronos on the other, the earth shaking. Literally, the accounts describe the shaking of the earth, sea boiling, the whole structure of the world under stress in a way it had never been under stress before. Because what was happening was not a war between armies, it was a war between orders of existence, between what the world had been and what it was going to become. Zeus freed the Cyclopes, the ones his grandfather had pushed back into the earth. He let them out, and they made him the thunderbolt. They made Poseidon his trident. They made Hades a helmet that made the wearer invisible. The weapons of the new gods came from the old workers, the ones who had been imprisoned for being too strange, too capable, too threatening to a sky god who wanted to remain the ceiling. Prometheus helped in some versions. Atlas fought for the Titans and lost and got his particular punishment, which is a whole other story. The Hecatonkaios fought for Zeus, those enormous 100-handed beings who had been imprisoned so long they had every reason to want the old order broken. The Titans lost. Kronos. The sources diverge here, and I'll tell you what I find most interesting about that divergence. The Greeks could not quite decide what happened to him. Most accounts say Tartarus. He went to the same depth he had sent his uncles to, the same abyss his father had wanted to use for his siblings. The cycle completes again. The cage is occupied by someone new. That version is tidy and has the satisfaction of a closed loop. But there's another version, older maybe, or just different. A tradition that says Kronos was eventually released. That Zeus, having won, let his father go to the islands of the blessed to rule over the dead who had lived well, to be the king of the golden age in whatever form the golden age could still exist, not imprisoned, not punished without end, released into something quieter. I don't know which version is true. They're both true in the way mythology is true, which is to say, neither is literally accurate, and both are pointing at something real. The question of what you do with a father who was monstrous and also built the world you live in. That question doesn't have a clean answer. The Greeks seem to have needed both stories to hold the whole weight of it. What I know is this. Kronos took the sickle because his mother asked him to, and because no one else would. He built a golden world. He swallowed his children to keep the thing he'd built. He was swallowed himself, in a way. Swallowed by the logic of the curse, by the fear that came with the knowing, by the same mechanism he had set in motion. He held on, as every king holds on, until the holding became the thing that broke him. The harvest god, the one who knew when to cut. He didn't know when to stop. Hyperion and Thea. The light couple, you could call them, though that phrase makes them sound simpler than they were. Their children were Helios, Selene, Eos, the sun, the moon, the dawn. And what strikes me about Helios in particular is the detail that the mythology doesn't bother giving him an inner life. He drives the chariot every day. That's it. He is the most reliable being in the entire Greek cosmos, the one who has never missed a shift. And the texts treat this reliability as so complete it becomes almost invisible, the way you stop noticing the sound of a refrigerator running. Helios drives. The day happens. Move on. Selene pulled her silver light across the night sky with silver horses, and her face always turned sideways, always watching at an angle. And there is something in that, in light that only reflects, that borrows its brightness from somewhere else, that the Greeks found worth preserving, worth naming, worth loving. I am not sure I can tell you exactly what that something is. I kept the detail because it felt important. Eos, they called rose-fingered, the dawn goddess who opens the gates each morning before her brother arrives with the full weight of day. The ancient sources mention her with a softness they don't always spare for gods with more dramatic portfolios. And I think that's because dawn is when people feel most aware of having survived the night. That gratitude needs somewhere to go. Coeus and Phoebe, intellect and radiance paired, grandparents of Apollo and Artemis through Leto, grandparents of Hecate through Asteria. They are the conceptual spine of two traditions the Greeks cared enormously about: understanding and illumination, the capacity to reason through a thing and the capacity to see it clearly. The mythology treats them as background, as progenitor furniture, and maybe that's what they were. Or maybe what they gave their grandchildren was so large it eclipsed them entirely. Themis, justice before law, the weight of right and wrong as a property of the universe, built in at the structural level, predating any court or king or tablet of rules. She is the principle that certain things are wrong, independent of whether anyone has decided to call them wrong. She would later advise Zeus sit beside him, which the sources mention without dwelling on. But I dwell on it, because it means the king of the new gods needed the old moral order to tell him how to govern, needed her, even after winning. Mnemosyne, memory, the capacity to hold the past inside the present tense. She would become the mother of the muses, which means all of art descends from her. Every poem, every song, every painting made to hold time still for a moment, all of it traces back to the Titan who was the living fact of remembering. I find this arrangement, I keep finding it, almost too precise to be accidental, even knowing that myths don't work by accident in the way that phrase implies. Iapetus, father of Prometheus, Epimetheus, Atlas, Menoetius. 4 sons, 4 different ways of being enormous and consequential, and ultimately unable to avoid catastrophe. Prometheus, who gave fire and paid for it. Epimetheus, who accepted the gift and paid for that. Atlas, who fought for the wrong side and got the weight of the sky as his particular consequence. Menoetius, who was proud and got struck down by a thunderbolt before he could become interesting. They are, taken together, a study in what happens to great capability when the world it enters hasn't quite figured out where to put it. Kronos held the southern pillar, one of 4 titans stationed at the corners of the flat earth, holding the sky in place so it could not collapse back down against the ground. He gets less text than anyone else, and I am giving him 1 more sentence than I gave him last time, which still isn't much. Let me collect the thread, because I want to get the next part right. 12 titans in total, 6 male, 6 female, the load-bearing structure of existence, born from the marriage, if you want to call it that, of earth and sky. And Uranus was afraid. Here's the thing about his fear that the mythology resists explaining because myths prefer action to motivation. His fear was rational. In the narrow, self-enclosed, local interest sense of that word, he was doing correct threat assessment. The Cyclopes could forge. The Hecatonchires could fight in ways that nothing could answer. He saw what he and Gaia had made, and he calculated correctly that what he had made could unmake him. That is the thought that lives in the back of the skull of everyone who has ever built something they want to keep. That the thing you built is also the thing most likely to eventually surpass you. Power is always most frightened by its own products, which is an observation the Greeks embedded into their cosmology so thoroughly it runs through every generation of their mythology without interruption. So, he didn't wait for the threat to arrive. He sent the Cyclopes back. 3 of them, Brontes, Steropes, Arges, thunder lightning bright, each enormous, each gifted with the kind of hands that could shape metal into things the universe had never seen before. Back into Gaia they went, back into the earth that had produced them, sealed down near Tartarus, unable to breathe or make or extend themselves in any direction. And then the Hecatonchires, Briareus, Cottus, Gyges, 50 heads, 100 arms each. The military arithmetic of that is, I keep trying to phrase it, and the phrase keeps being inadequate, like trying to describe a storm by listing its components. 100 arms, each capable of hurling stone the size of a building, simultaneously, in every direction at once. No formation holds against that. No shield wall, no position, no strategy. They were the weapon that ends the argument before the argument starts. He pushed them down too. Gaia held them inside her. 6 children, 3 cyclopes, 3 hecatonchires, pressing against the inside of the earth, unable to get out, all that mass and heat and strength contained in a space that had no room for it. The ancient sources say she suffered. They say it plainly. She was in agony of the specific kind the earth has. Earthquakes, upheavals, the grinding of something enormous, trying to find relief and finding only more compression. Anyway, she called to her Titan children, the 12. She told them what was happening, and she asked who had the will to do something about it. 11 of them heard her. 11 of them looked at their father, the sky, the thing that covered everything and saw everything, and had already demonstrated precisely what it did with children who became inconvenient. And 11 of them said nothing, stayed quiet, kept their domains and their orbits and their careful distance from a father who had shown them the cost of drawing his attention. The fear worked. That's what I want to say about it. As a technology of control, Uranus' fear worked perfectly, worked exactly as fear is supposed to work, which is to say, it worked right up until the moment it stopped working entirely and could never be repaired. He had 12 children capable of acting. He had rendered 11 of them unwilling. He had bought time, this is a strange thing to say about the father of the harvest god, but he had bought time as if it were loyalty, not realizing that time spent in silence is the time most effectively used for deciding. The 12th Titan heard Gaia. The 12th one said yes. Kronos stepped forward. Stay there for a second. Before the judgment comes, before the mythology closes its fist around what he did next and decides what kind of figure he is, stay in that moment. A child who heard his mother in pain and looked directly at it instead of away. He watched his 11 siblings weigh the situation and reach the same conclusion, the same clean calculation. Stay quiet, stay safe, keep your domain. Pretend you can't hear what's happening inside the earth beneath your feet. And something in Kronos refused, whether that was love or fury, or the particular compressed energy of someone who has grown up inside a tyrant's shadow and has spent every hour since waiting for a moment that could justify what he already wanted to do. I don't think those were separate things. I'm not sure they ever are. Gaia gave him the sickle. She'd made it herself, pulled grey flint from somewhere inside her own body, shaped it into a curve, gave it an edge. The first cutting tool, the first harvesting blade, made from the substance of the one who had been wronged, fashioned specifically for this moment, handed to the youngest child with instructions. And Kronos took it, and he went to wait. He waited where the earth and the sky met. In that thin zone, the barely a gap between them, the shadow at the edge of their contact, the sickle in his hand, the instructions in his head, the weight of what he was about to do pressing against him in a way I'm not sure language quite handles, because it wasn't just weight. It had texture, it had direction. It was the specific feeling of a door about to open that cannot be closed again once it does. Uranus came down as he came every night. He settled against Gaia the way he always settled. The ancient, intimate arrangement, the sky spreading over the earth, the contact complete. He was exposed in every sense. He was not prepared. Kronos reached up and made the cut. The sources are specific about what was severed, and I won't be, except to say, Uranus was unmanned, permanently, and what was cut away was thrown into the sea, and from the blood that reached the water the Erinyes were born, the Furies, who would spend the rest of mythological time pursuing anyone who broke an oath made between blood relations, who shed blood that shared their blood. The giants rose from it too. The Mealy, nymphs of ash trees, came from the same wound, and from the foam, from the sea foam that gathered around what Uranus lost, the disturbance of divine substance hitting ocean. Aphrodite came up, the love goddess, born from that. I have read this detail many times, and I still don't know what to do with the feeling it produces. The Greeks knew exactly what they were doing when they told it this way. They were saying that love, the real kind, the pull that makes a person unable to sleep, unable to stop reaching towards someone, entered the world at the moment the old order was cut open, that it came from the wound, that beauty arrives sometimes from the moment when the one who controlled everything finally loses something they cannot get back. I find this either profound or deeply uncomfortable, and most days it is both at once. Uranus fell back. The ceiling of the universe diminished, something total made partial, and from his pain, from the specific, irreversible pain of a god who had held everything and had just had something essential taken, came words, a curse or a prophecy, and in the ancient world, these were the same thing when they came from the right mouth. He told Kronos, "Your children will do this to you." A statement delivered from the authority of someone who understood right then, perhaps for the first time, that the cycle he had been afraid of had always included him, that what he had feared in his children was recognition. He had seen in them what he had done, and his son had done it to him. And the pattern, the old, patient, indifferent repetition of generation overthrowing generation, would keep moving after Kronos, just as it had kept moving after Uranus. Kronos heard it. He took the throne, Lord of the Titans, God of the harvest, God of the sickle, the curved grey flint blade now a symbol of his authority over everything. He stood at the center of the world and declared the new order, and from the very first moment of his reign, from that very first breath of power, the prophecy was already living in him, already doing its work. Let me collect the thread, because the next part is the one I think people rush past, and I don't want to rush past it. The Golden Age was real. I want to say this without qualification, before I start adding qualifications. Hesiod writes about it as history, or what functions as history in the 8th century before the Common Era. Ovid writes about it the same way, with that particular register that means this is the thing we lost, not the thing we invented. A time under Kronos' reign when the world was, by every measure available to the people describing it, genuinely better than anything that came after. The earth gave grain without being plowed. orchards fruited without cultivation. Seasons move through their cycle without extremity, without the grinding punishment of summer heat or winter deprivation. Just a soft and reasonable progression of conditions that supported life instead of periodically testing whether life could hold on. People didn't labor in the way they labor now. They didn't age toward ruin. They didn't wall themselves off from each other or pull to one end what was being taken from the other. Justice was the condition of the world. It didn't need enforcement because enforcement implies the possibility of violation, and violation it just wasn't the shape of things. Not then. When they died the way a person falls asleep when they're genuinely exhausted, and the room is the right temperature, and there's nothing left that needs doing tonight. Quietly, without the inventory of unfinished things pressing against the inside of the chest. Hesiod wrote about this. Ovid wrote about it. They both wrote about it with something underneath the words that feels like grief, like the specific grief of someone who knows the address of a place they cannot return to. And here is the thing that almost never gets said plainly. This was Kronos. The golden age was his. The best time, the reference point for every civilization since that has tried to describe paradise. That was under the rule of the god who castrated his father and swallowed his children. The god of the Sickle built the world that everyone afterward would spend the rest of history mourning. How do you hold that? I've been sitting with that question for longer than I can account for, and I keep arriving at the same answer, which is maybe obvious, but still feels like it costs something to say. It was good for everyone, except the people closest to him, the ones he called his children, the ones he claimed most completely. Power in this story, as in every story, is most dangerous for whoever it loves most. Anyway, Rhea, his wife, his sister, the sixth of the Titans. She is the figure in this whole narrative who tends to disappear between her husband and her son, Kronos on one side, Zeus on the other, and Rhea in the middle, doing the thing that actually changes everything, while the story looks elsewhere. I find this irritating, if I'm being honest. I find the way she gets treated as transitional, as the hinge between two more interesting figures, genuinely irritating. And I want to slow down here deliberately, because she deserves it. She was the earth in its living aspect. That's the distinction that matters. Gaia was the substrate, the deep stone, the geological slow time of the original ground. Rhea was the earth as it breathes. The earth that supports what grows on it, that moves with the seasons, that is warm rather than ancient. She was the mother of gods in the literal sense. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, Zeus, all born from her, all taken from her by a husband who loved her the way certain people love, completely and destructively, and with no apparent understanding that the two things were in conflict. She rode in a chariot drawn by lions. That detail arrives in the sources, like a correction, like the mythology clearing its throat, reminding you that the figure you might be imagining as passive and maternal is in fact drawn through the world by lions. She was a force of nature whose domain was nurturing. These are different things, and she was both simultaneously, which is harder to maintain than it sounds. Kronos had heard the prophecy. He held it the way you hold something you can't put down, and can't use and can't stop touching. His children would do to him what he had done to his father. The pattern said so. Uranus had said so, and Uranus, whatever else he was, had recognized the shape of the thing. So, Hestia was born. Kronos took her, swallowed her whole, while Rhea held her for whatever the interval was between birth and taking, which the sources don't specify, but which I think about more than the sources invite me to. Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. 5 children, 5 takings, each one alive inside him. This is specified, they were alive, held in the dark interior of their father, the way the Titans had been held in the dark interior of their grandmother, the cycle completing itself with the mechanical precision of something that has no interest in being stopped. 5 times. Rhea watched it happen 5 times, gave birth, and gave the child up to the god she was married to, who swallowed the child to keep the prophecy from arriving. By the 6th pregnancy, she had made a decision. She went to Gaia, the original Earth, her mother, and Gaia told her what to do, and Rhea did it. She went to Crete. She gave birth. The child was Zeus. She wrapped a stone, swaddled it in cloth the size of a newborn, the weight of a newborn, close enough, apparently, for a god who had swallowed 5 children without ever looking closely at what he was receiving. And she handed it to Kronos, and he swallowed it. He swallowed a rock. The child was in Crete, growing, becoming whatever Zeus was going to become, fed by a goat named Amalthea, guarded by the Curetes, who danced and clashed their spears against their shields whenever the infant made a sound, the noise of their shields covering the sound of the divine child who was not supposed to exist yet. Rhea had done it, the most consequential act in this entire generation of mythology, the act that makes the next world possible. And she'd done it by handing her husband a stone and trusting that power, when it is frightened enough, stops paying attention. She was right. She was patient the way mountains are patient, which is to say her patience was geological, structural, built into what she was rather than chosen as a response to circumstances. She endured. She loved Kronos. The sources don't suggest otherwise. Don't frame the marriage as cold or strategic or merely functional. She loved him in whatever way Titans love, which is at a scale that makes human love look like a preliminary sketch. And he kept eating her children. Hestia first, goddess of the hearth, of the fire at the center of every home, the ritual that says, this space is inhabited, this space is protected. Firstborn and last rescued, the bookend of the 5. And there is something in that, in the goddess of the sacred domestic fire being the first one swallowed, that I cannot fully articulate but keep returning to, the way you keep pressing on a bruise to confirm it's still there. Then Demeter, goddess of grain, of cultivation, of the bread the harvest makes possible, a harvest goddess, swallowed by the harvest god. The mythology tucks this in without comment and moves forward, and I think it's doing it deliberately, placing the detail where only the attentive reader will feel it land. Then Hera, then Hades, who would spend the rest of mythological time being misread, the god of the dead and the ruler of the dead's kingdom, which are related but distinct things, a distinction the subsequent centuries rarely bothered to honor. Then Poseidon, 5 children, 5 births. I want to stay in that for a moment because the story is about to accelerate, and once it accelerates, it doesn't slow down. And if we skip past what those 5 births meant, then we've missed something the rest of the narrative depends on. Rhea held each one. That's the fact I keep coming back to. She held each newborn, the weight of it, the specific gravity of a new life pressing against her chest, a face that was hers and Kronos's, and also entirely its own unprecedented thing, something the universe had produced exactly once and would never produce again in exactly that configuration. She had that. For some interval, the sources don't specify. And then Kronos took the child. He did not kill them. The mythology is precise about this, and the precision is doing real work. He swallowed them alive, conscious, into the interior of a Titan god's body, where they could not grow and could not age. Because gods don't die, even swallowed gods don't die. They just exist in the dark and wait. 5 gods suspended in the space, between where they had been born from and the world they had been born to live in, pressing against the inside of their father, the way the Cyclopes and the Ekatonkaires had pressed against the inside of their grandmother. The cycle again, always the cycle. This mythology loves its cycles the way some people love their wounds, returning to them, pressing on them, confirming they haven't healed, weirdly proud of how long they've held their shape. And every time, Rhea was left with empty arms, the physics of that. The arms that held weight and then held only air. There is no philosophy adequate to that transition, no framework that makes it feel like anything other than what it is. She went through it 5 times, and I find this genuinely hard to describe without either overwriting it or flattening it. This is where I think Rhea becomes the most interesting figure in this entire generation of the mythology, because she does not collapse. She goes quiet. She goes inward into whatever patience she inherited from Gaia, who inherited it from whatever was before Gaia, the patience of something that predates time and intends to outlast it. And she started planning. Let me collect the thread before I rush forward, because the planning matters and I want to give it its weight. There is a specific quality to grief when it repeats. The first loss is total, disorienting, the floor gone. The second loss arrives at a door. The first loss already opened and finds the room behind it already rearranged, already shaped around the absence. It fits into the space the first loss made, smoothly, the way something fits when it was always going to fit. By the 5th loss, Rhea had become someone for whom grief was the climate, the permanent atmospheric condition, the weather of existing under this particular sky with this particular husband. She moved through it the way you move through air that is always slightly too heavy to breathe comfortably, always costs just a fraction more than it should. She still loved him. This is the part that most resists explanation and most rewards sitting with. She still loved Kronos. The mythology doesn't present this as blindness or denial. She held both things simultaneously. The Titan who stepped forward when all his siblings calculated their own safety. The one who answered Gaia when no one else would. Who built the golden age that gave the world its best time. And the god who took her children from her arms. She held both without resolving them into a simple verdict, because they were the same being, and that being was her husband. And love at this scale does not have the luxury of simple verdicts. She carried the 6th child in secret, She went to Gaia. Gaia was the earth, had been here before all of this, would be hereafter. She contained the whole history of everything that had ever grown on her and died on her. Every harvest, every winter. She knew what needed to happen. She told Rhea what to do anyway. The cave. I want to talk about the cave because I think people move past it too quickly on the way to the stone and the swallowing and the mechanics of the plan, and the cave itself carries something worth stopping for. Zeus enters the world in a cave in Crete, in the dark, in the cold mineral quiet of a place the surface world doesn't reach. And what strikes me, what I find I cannot stop turning over, is that this is where every story of the kind puts its most consequential arrival. The thing that will change everything always begins in the low place, the hidden place, the place that has not yet attracted the attention of whatever would be threatened by what it contains. Joseph in the pit, Moses in the bulrushes, the stable, the cold, the ordinary animals. The cave is the first chapter of a specific kind of story, the kind where the future has to stay invisible until it's ready to stop being invisible, where what the powerful most fear must be kept in the dark until the dark has done its work. Zeus grew there, tended by Amalthea, a nymph, a goat, both, neither. The mythology is comfortable holding the ambiguity, and I've stopped fighting it. And from the abundance of that tending came the cornucopia, which is a detail so strange and generous. I'm not sure what to do with it, except keep it. The most precarious childhood in the mythological tradition was also somehow the most abundantly provided for. He had honey, he had milk, he had everything he needed to become what he was going to become, supplied from a source so modest, the story almost forgets to mention it. Outside the cave, the Curette danced. They clashed their shields in rhythm. They made noise, organized and deliberate, timed to cover the sound of a child inside who could not be heard by what would stop him. And I know this is where I'm supposed to be restrained about the parallel, but there is something in that image. Warriors making rhythmic protective sound so the one inside can grow undetected, that I find, sitting here late writing this, genuinely difficult to move past without acknowledging. A voice, a story, a space held open by deliberate noise, the thing inside growing, the outside holding its position. The stone. Rhea wrapped it herself, swaddled it in cloth, held it the size and weight of a newborn, close enough, apparently, for a god who had received 5 children without ever looking closely at the face, and brought it to Kronos, and he took it and swallowed it whole. He swallowed a rock and did not notice. This is either, I started to say, this is either the funniest or the saddest detail in the entire mythology, but those aren't the right categories. They collapse into each other here. Power, at sufficient levels of fear, stops paying attention. It becomes so concerned with the threat it's managing that it loses the capacity to verify whether what it's managing is real. He had swallowed 5 children, and the procedure had worked 5 times, and so the 6th time his hands received the expected weight, and his throat performed the expected action, and his body registered the expected completion, and he felt, presumably, the expected relief. The child was in Crete, growing in the dark, becoming something. Rhea stood with empty arms again, but this time the arms were empty differently. This time the weight had gone somewhere the harvest god couldn't reach it, somewhere the sky couldn't see it, somewhere the prophecy was quietly being assembled in the dark. She was patient the way mountains are patient. She waited. The sixth pregnancy was different because Rhea decided it would be different. She didn't follow the pattern the first 5 births had established. Birth, presentation, loss, the terrible efficiency of it. She disappeared, traveled to Crete in some versions, to Lyctos in others, to a cave on Mount Dicte in still others, deep inside the mountain, in the kind of dark that is specific to interior stone, the dark that has nothing to do with whether the sun has set. She gave birth there, underground, attended by the earth itself, in the silence that exists so far down that the surface world becomes something you have to take on faith. She held him, whatever interval she could take without the holding making release, impossible. And I find this genuinely hard to write past without slowing down, because what the mythology is describing is a specific kind of love, the love that is most complete precisely when it knows it cannot last, that gives everything now because now is what's available. She held him with the full attention she had, which was the attention of a titan, which is enormous, and then she let him go. She found a stone, specific, grey, from the cave floor, the right weight, the right size, wrapped it in cloth, carried it back. Kronos did not look. Why would he? He had done this 5 times. The fear that drove the procedure had long since stopped requiring his conscious participation. He received the bundle, felt the familiar weight, performed the familiar action, stone and cloth down into the dark. In the cave, a child opened his eyes, the one the prophecy had been about before he had a name, the storm that would reorganize everything. He had been swallowed and had escaped being swallowed at the same time. Present in the world because a piece of the earth had been sent in his place, because his mother had gambled on the inattention of a frightened god and won. The Koretz stationed themselves outside and beat their bronze shields together in rhythm to drown out the sounds of an infant who hadn't yet learned to be quiet about his existence. The clanging of shields was the first lullaby. It was the story's first act of communal protection, a circle of guardians arranged around something simultaneously the most vulnerable and the most dangerous thing alive, because Zeus was both in that cave, at that age, vulnerable the way any infant is vulnerable, dangerous because of what he was going to become. He was nursed by Amalthea, the goat, the nymph, both, neither. The mythology holds the ambiguity, and I have decided to stop worrying about it. And from her horn, or from her, came the cornucopia, the symbol of inexhaustible abundance, the horn of plenty that can never run out, which means the most precarious childhood in the mythology was simultaneously the most abundantly provided for. And I don't know what to do with that paradox except say it plainly and leave it sitting there. He had honey from bees that found the cave. Eagles watched the mountain above him. The natural world organized itself around him the way things sometimes organize around what they sense is coming before the coming is official. He grew in the dark, gathered himself, learned patience from having no alternative to patience, learned concealment from the fact of his existence depending on it, learned, and this is the skill that the rest of the mythology will run on, how to want something enormous and contain the wanting until the moment for it arrives. Power is not force in the end. Force is the crude version. The sophisticated version is the ability to hold the wanting inside without leaking it, without showing it, without reaching for it too early and alerting what would stop you. Let me collect the thread here, because Métis comes next, and Métis matters, and I want to give her what she's owed. Métis, daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, the ocean couple, the oldest functional marriage in the mythology. Her name means something like wisdom, something like cunning, something like the practical intelligence that solves problems by understanding their shape rather than battering against them. She was the intelligence of strategy, of knowing which way the grain bends before you try to cut it. She represented a kind of knowing the Titans had not developed, and the early Olympians were still learning, and the mythology gives her to Zeus before the war, because Zeus without Métis is just another powerful figure with a grievance. Métis is what made him a king, rather than just a victor. She brought him something. The sources describe it differently. Herbal compound, mustard, and salt in wine, a preparation Gaia supplied through Métis' hands. What it was specifically mattered less than what it did. It would make Kronos give back what he had taken. But first, Zeus had to get close enough to administer it. Think about what that required. Walk toward it slowly, because the story tends to rush past this, and I don't want to. He was approaching a god whose entire reign had been organized around preventing his existence. A father whose fear of him was the reason he had grown up underground, the reason the first sounds of his life had been shields clanging to drown out his crying. Kronos did not know Zeus existed, which meant the moment he did know, fear would arrive first, before recognition, before anything that might have functioned as paternal instinct. The fear was wired in, prophesied, older than Zeus's name. So Zeus went in disguise. A cupbearer, the sources say. A servant, occupying the role that domestic servants have always occupied in the households of the powerful. Present without being seen, necessary without being valued, close enough to pour the drink. He got close. He poured. The drink went down, and Kronos began to vomit. It came up in reverse order of swallowing. Poseidon first, then Hades, then Hera, then Demeter, then Hestia. Last swallowed, first freed. 5 gods rising from the interior darkness of their father into the air of the world that had always been theirs, each one carrying whatever a long time in a confined dark gives you, which I suspect is something close to an absolute appreciation for space, for breath, for the specific gift of being able to move your arms. Then the stone came up, the grey flint stone that had sat in the belly of a god for however long, absorbing the heat and the dark of that interior. It was taken to Delphi, to the Omphalos, the naval of the world, the exact center around which all Greek geography organized itself, placed there, kept there, carved and marked and venerated. If you had gone to Delphi in the ancient world and pressed your hands against that stone, you would have been touching the thing that was swallowed in place of a god, the substitute, the proxy, the piece of earth that sat in the dark so something else could grow in the light. I don't know why that detail affects me as much as it does. I kept it anyway. There is a passage in this story that almost always gets skipped over in the rush toward the war, and I want to stay in it, because I think losing it loses something that the war itself depends on. Kronos was a harvester. Before everything else, before throne, before prophecy, before children swallowed and a stone sent in their place. He was the god of the harvest, and harvesting is one of the most demanding, most precise, most intimate relationships any being can have with the living world around it. You have to know the grain, actually know it, what it looks like when it needs more time, what it looks like when the moment is exactly right, what it looks like when you've waited too long and the field is starting to give the grain back to the earth without you. You have to read it. The angle of the stalk, the color of the head, the way it moves in a specific wind at a specific point in its maturity. And then you have to cut at the right height, high enough to take what's valuable, low enough to leave the root system capable of being planted again. A harvest done wrong in either direction is a failure. Too soon and you've wasted the growing. Too late and the earth has already begun its reclamation. This is what the sickle is. This is what it means. The sickle is not a sword. I want to be specific about this because the two get conflated, and the conflation costs something. A sword is designed to cut whatever presents itself. The sickle is designed to discriminate, to move through a field and know, stroke by stroke, what is ready and what needs more time. The entire function of the implement requires judgment, requires, this is the word I keep arriving at, wisdom. The embodied, accumulated, unreplicable wisdom of someone who has watched enough cycles to know where in the cycle any given thing currently stands. The god who carried that knowledge, who had that precision built into his nature, encoded in his domain, expressed through the instrument that was his symbol from the moment his mother placed it in his hands in the dark beneath Gaia's surface. That god was afraid of his children and swallowed them whole. And here is the thing that I find myself unable to resolve, sitting here late with this, the thing that keeps the story from closing into a simple shape. The failure was a failure of the very skill he was supposed to embody. Kronos, the god of knowing when to cut, of knowing when something has reached its fullness and the moment of transformation has arrived. Kronos, precisely that god, could not recognize when his own time was complete, could not read his own cycle, could not look at his children and understand that what he was seeing was the next form of the world, ready, arrived, asking only to be allowed to exist. He cut everything except what most needed cutting. He held on when the sickle's wisdom would have been to open the hand. Kronos was the god of that knowing, of the discrimination between ready and unready, between the moment and the moment before it. The god of the irreversible cut made at precisely the right time, which means he was the god who had to carry the weight of knowing, actually knowing, in his hands and his arms and his reading of the angle of the stalk. When something had fulfilled what it was in this form and was ready to become something else. The Romans understood this about him in a way the later Greek tradition sometimes let go. They called him Saturn, and under that name they built Saturnalia. 7 days in December, when the year was turning, the light at its minimum, the cold at its maximum, the world at the furthest possible distance from summer abundance. And for those 7 days, the rigid architecture of Roman social life came down. Slaves were given a week's freedom. Masters cooked for them. Masters waited on them at table. The ones who served all year were served. The ones who were served all year stood up and brought the food. Public banquets opened to everyone. Gifts changed hands across every line that the ordinary year kept fixed. And I want to be precise about this because the mythology tends to be sentimental here in ways that obscure what was actually happening. This was Rome, and Rome was Rome. And when the week ended, the enslaved people went back to being enslaved. And no one at the time thought Saturnalia was a step toward anything different. It was a valve, not a revolution. The hierarchy rested for 7 days and then resumed. But within those 7 days, within that narrow window of inversion, something was being remembered. Something was being honored that the ordinary year had no mechanism for honoring. They were celebrating the god of the golden age, celebrating the memory of a world organized around general abundance, rather than concentrated extraction, a world that gave to everyone rather than to those positioned to take. They lit candles against the December dark. They opened their tables wider than the tables usually went. They danced in the streets, the sources say. And I believe it, because there is a specific quality to dancing that happens when a permission you don't usually have is temporarily granted, a looseness in it, a body that has been held for 11 months, finally given 7 days to move how it wants to move. And then it ended, but the candles had been lit. That's the thing I keep coming back to, and I'm not totally sure how to say it without it sounding smaller than it is. The table had been wider. The memory had been enacted physically, with bodies and food and fire and actual gifts pressed into actual hands. Every December candlelight since, every communal feast, every moment when the served and the serving briefly trade places carries somewhere in its ancestry the festival of Saturn, the memory of the golden age, the stubborn, irrational, genuinely beautiful insistence that the world was better once, and that for at least a week you can make it better again. This is Kronos persisting in the world. This is him not as monster, not as cautionary tale, but as the thing the human heart keeps refusing to stop believing, that the abundance was real, that it was good, that we remember it even when we can't access it, that the remembering itself is worth something. Let me collect the thread, because the war comes next, and I want to give what happened just before it the time it deserves. The 5 gods came out of Kronos. I don't know why this moment moves through most tellings so quickly. It is one of the strangest, most compressed, most consequential moments in the entire body of Greek mythology. 5 divine beings who had been imprisoned in their father's body for an unmeasured span of time, coming out into the light of a world they had been born to inhabit, and then immediately denied. 5 gods blinking. 5 gods taking their first breath of real air. 5 gods discovering what they were. Hestia came out first, the hearth goddess, the sacred domestic fire, the flame that was supposed to burn continuously at the center of every home, whose going out meant the household's end. She had been first swallowed, which means she had been inside the dark for longest, and she came out immediately herself, immediately oriented toward warmth. She did not rage, did not storm, did not spend the subsequent mythology making her father pay for what he had done. She found the hearth, which was everywhere, and she returned to it. She was the only Olympian who later gave up her seat among the 12 to Dionysus without apparent conflict. She simply moved. She found the fire and sat beside it and gave heat outward in all directions without playing favorites, which is what fire does, which is what she was. Demeter came out reaching for things that grow. She had been the goddess of grain in the belly of the god of the harvest, which is a compression the mythology doesn't dwell on, but which I find almost unbearably precise. The principle of what the earth produces, held inside the principle of the cutting of what the earth produces. She came out with a specific grief already built into her, a grief for growing things that could not grow in the dark, and that grief would define everything she did afterward. The later myth, the one where Persephone is taken and Demeter stops the world, holds the seasons, lets the fields go grey and the grain refuse to rise. That is not an overreaction from a distraught mother. That is a goddess who had already spent years inside the closed and the dark, already knew exactly what it cost, already had the knowledge of deprivation encoded in her body, acting from that knowledge. She came out already containing the capacity for all of it. Hera came out with force, with expansion, with the pressure of something compressed to its limit finally released, moving outward in every direction at once. She was the goddess of the bond between two people, of the sacred weight of the vow, of the law that governs what one person owes another. And she had been put in a stomach by the person who owed her most. I find it hard to describe what that does to a being without flattening it. She came out understanding from the inside that bonds mean nothing to the one who holds the power to break them. Her entire mythological career, the jealousy, the pursuit, the relentless tracking of every violation, later generations called it bitterness, called it possessiveness, called it the behavior of a difficult wife. What they were observing was a goddess who had learned in the belly of her father what bond violation actually feels like from inside the broken bond. She came out already knowing. Anyway, Hades. 4 things. He was fourth swallowed. He was quiet when he emerged. He was given the underworld in the division after the war, which the mythology calls a lottery, though one notices that a truly random lottery would not consistently assign the worst kingdom to the one who had been longest in enclosed darkness. He went without complaint. He built his kingdom. He kept the dead with more consistency and fairness than most of the gods who got kingdoms with sunlight in them. He had nothing left to prove. He had already been in the worst place. Everything after that was, by comparison, open. Poseidon came out like something detonating. He had been compressed. The compression had taught him something about compression that could not be untaught, could not be metabolized into acceptance, could only be expressed as permanent refusal. He became the god of the uncontainable, the sea that cannot be walled, the earthquake that cannot be predicted, the storm that will not negotiate. He shook the earth when he was angry. He raised the water when he wanted to make a point. He was the god of force that resists being shaped, and he was that god specifically because he had been shaped, closed in, held, and the rest of his existence was everything that holding had failed to contain. 5 gods, into the light. Then the stone came up, the grey flint stone swallowed in Zeus's place, sitting in the interior of a Titan god for as long as it sat there, absorbing whatever the interior of a Titan god contains. When Kronos expelled it, it was taken to Delphi, to the Omphalos, the naval stone, the point the Greeks called the center of the world, the exact location around which all geography organized itself. It was placed there, carved, marked, kept. If you had gone to Delphi, made the journey up the mountain, past the olive trees and the spring and the carved stone offerings piled along the path, arrived at the sanctuary, pressed your hands against the Omphalos, you would have been touching the thing sent into the dark instead of a god, the substitute, the proxy, the piece of earth that took the place of what needed to survive, a stone that sat in the dark so something could grow in the light and was honored for the rest of antiquity for having done so. I don't entirely know what to do with that. I kept it in because it felt like the kind of thing you keep in. The war was coming, had always been coming. The prophecy had made it inevitable before Zeus had a name, before he had a face, before he had anything except the fact of his existence as the thing Kronos most feared. Inevitable in mythology does not move on a schedule, but it does move. The Titanomachy, 10 years. The sources use that number with the confidence of people describing something that left a mark on the structure of the world itself. Not 10 years as a rough estimate, but 10 years as the duration required when 2 orders of existence are deciding which one gets to continue. The earth shook through it. The sea boiled in some accounts. The sky was involved in ways the sources struggle to describe without sounding like they are describing the end of everything, because in a real sense they are. The end of the Titan order, which had been everything, was the end of everything that had previously called itself permanent. Zeus freed the Cyclopes from Tartarus, the ones Uranus had pushed back into the earth for being too capable, too threatening, too gifted with the wrong kind of hands. Out they came, and in gratitude or in alignment with what they had always been built to produce, they made the thunderbolt, the trident, the helmet that made Hades invisible. The weapons of the new order, forged by the old workers, the ones who had been imprisoned for being good at exactly this. The Hecatonchires fought on Zeus's side, 100 hands each. The military arithmetic of that, as I said before, ends arguments. The Titans had no answer to it. The Titans lost Kronos. The sources diverge. Most say Tartarus. Down into the abyss beneath the abyss, the deep beneath the deep, the place his grandfather had used for the Cyclops and the Hecatonchires, the place he himself had used for the beings he feared. The cage he had closed around others now closed around him. The cycle again. But there is another version, older or just different. Tradition that says Zeus eventually released him. That Kronos was sent to the islands of the blessed, to rule over the dead who had lived well, to be the king of whatever remained of the golden age, in whatever form it could still exist, released into something quieter, into the after-image of the world he had built. I don't know which version is true. Both are true in the way mythology is true. The question of what you do with a father who was monstrous and also made the world you live in, that question doesn't close. The Greeks seem to have needed both endings to hold the whole weight of it. The harvest god, the one who knew when to cut. He held on past the moment. He mistook holding for wisdom. He could read every field except the one he stood in. The stone sits at Delphi. The candles still get lit in December. The table still gets wider, briefly, once a year. If you had gone to Delphi, made the journey up the mountain, past the olive trees and the spring and the carved stone offerings accumulating along the path over centuries, and pressed your hands against the omphalos, the cool, pale naval stone, you would have been touching the thing that went into the dark in place of a god, the substitute, the proxy, the piece of earth that absorbed the dark so something else could grow in the light. There is something in that worth pressing your hands against. I'm not entirely sure how to say what it is, but I kept it. Before the war, a moment, quiet in the mythology, almost overlooked, sitting in the margin where important things tend to wait. Zeus went to Tartarus, all the way down, past the underworld of the dead, past the roots of the mountains, into the oldest and deepest dark in the structure of existence. The place Uranus had used, the place that had been absorbing what the powerful refused to face since before Kronos took the throne. Zeus went there with nectar and ambrosia, and he sat with the Cyclopes and the Hekatonchires in the dark, and he fed them. These beings who had been down there through the entire reign of Kronos, through the golden age, through the abundance and the gentle seasons happening above them while they existed without air or space or the ability to extend a single one of their 100 arms in any direction. Zeus fed them, and then he asked for their help. The Cyclopes gave him the thunderbolt. They gave Poseidon the trident. They gave Hades a helmet that made the wearer invisible. And the Hekatonchires came up from the abyss with all their 100 arms finally given space to move, their 50 heads oriented toward the sky, and they stood alongside the Olympians, and the war became a different kind of war. 10 years, the mythology says, 10 years, with the confidence of someone describing something that left a physical mark on the world's architecture. Not 10 as approximation, but 10 as the actual duration required when two orders of existence are deciding which one continues. 9 of those years, the balance held. Mount Othrys for the Titans, Mount Olympus for the Olympians. 9 years of the cosmos shaking between them. Mountains used as projectiles, seas redirected, skies beaten dark. The ocean ran backward in some accounts. The earth cracked and steamed along the cracks. The light flickered. The ancient writers described the sounds of it as having no equivalent in human experience. Not thunder, not earthquake, but the sound of the world structure debating whether to hold. Then the Hekatonchires entered, 300 arms launching simultaneously, 300 boulders per salvo, from every direction at once, without pause, without physical limit, without the constraint that makes every other weapon eventually run dry. There is no defense against an attack that arrives from every direction simultaneously, because defense requires knowing which direction to face. And when 300 projectiles arrive at once, there is no facing that helps you. The Titans broke. Most went to Tartarus, taken to the place they had used as a prison by the beings they had kept in it, sealed in with bronze and stone and the weight of everything above them. Atlas, who had led the Titan armies, who had committed most completely to the old order, received a different sentence. the sky on his shoulders, Uranus pressing down through his body indefinitely, the sky and earth held apart by one Titan's endurance, which is, I want to call this poetic justice, but that phrase is too neat for what it actually is. It's just the logic of the mythology completing itself. And Kronos. Here the sources stop agreeing, and I find the disagreement more honest than any single ending would be. Some say Tartarus, sealed in the dark with his brothers, imprisoned in the place he had used for others, the cage finally occupied by the one who had closed it on everyone else. Some say Zeus gave him a mercy none of the other Titans received, exiled him sideways rather than down to the islands of the fortunate at the western edge of the world, where heroes go after extraordinary deaths, where the light is permanent and golden and nothing is harsh, where he rules still, maybe. A gentle sovereignty over the best of the human dead, watching the sun go into the Western Ocean, presiding over the long golden aftermath of a war he lost and a reign he built and a world he was. I need to pause here. I've been writing toward this for a while, and I want to say it carefully. Both endings might be true. Both might be necessary. The most honest thing I can say about Kronos is that he always contained both at once. The being who deserved Tartarus and the being who deserved the golden shore, the darkness and the abundance, the sickle and the harvest, the fear eating at the edges of the best world anyone ever built. The story seems to promise a clean verdict and then declines to deliver one. I think this is correct. I think the mythology is being accurate rather than evasive. Anyway, Rhea. Now that the war has settled and the Olympian order has established itself and the dramatics of the new generation have begun, now is when the mythology tends to let Rhea drift to the margins, as though her role was the plan and the stone, and then finished, as though she were a device rather than a being. She outlived the age she was built for. She was a Titan, born before the war, before the thunderbolt, before the reorganization of everything. She had lived through Uranus's reign and Kronos' reign, and had given birth 6 times, had held each child for whatever interval was available, and then surrendered them, had found in herself, and this is the part I cannot fully describe, only gesture at, the capacity to keep giving after 5 consecutive takings, because the alternative was to become someone who stops, and Rhea does not stop. She saved Zeus. She saved all of them. She was the hinge point. Without the plan, without the stone, without her willingness to go to Gaia and ask what to do, and then actually do it, Kronos holds the stone. The war never happens. The Olympians are never freed. The universe stays in the Titan Age, and the Golden Age grows slowly more fearful and more closed and more shaped by the paranoia at its center. Rhea is why any of it changed. The mythology acknowledges this and then moves past it with a speed that feels like, I don't want to say ingratitude. The mythology doesn't feel things, but there is something in the pacing that bothers me. She became the Great Mother afterward, Cybele in Phrygia, Magna Mater in Rome, the lion-accompanied goddess, worshipped from Anatolia to Britain with tambourines and ecstatic rites and a presence that preceded any specific culture's claim on her, that moved through civilizations the way water moves through different containers without becoming what the container is. She was always there in the background of the stories that followed, the mother of gods who had made the new world possible, and then stepped back from it, not diminished, but something like relieved, something like the feeling of putting down something very heavy after a very long time and finding that the arms still work. The harvest is the transition, not the ending. The moment when what has grown goes into the next form of its existence, becomes seed, becomes bread, becomes the next season's possibility. Rhea understood this without needing it explained to her, which is perhaps what it means to be the goddess of the earth's living aspect, rather than its stone. Cycles. The story is ultimately about cycles, and I want to say this plainly before we run out of time. Uranus imprisoned his children because he feared what they would do when they grew. Kronos freed those children through his mother's plan and his own willingness, and then swallowed his own children because he feared what they would do when they grew. Zeus swallowed Metis when she was pregnant because of a prophecy that her child would surpass him. The fear does not break when the throne changes hands. The fear is part of the throne. It comes with it, folded in, stitched to the underside of the seat, and whoever sits down finds it already there waiting. The Greeks were not naive about this. They built this pattern through 3 generations with full awareness of what they were building. They were showing that power does not transcend the fears that attend it simply by arriving on a new pair of shoulders. The second generation inherits the first generation's fear along with the first generation's throne, and the third generation inherits both along with a slightly reduced version, because something, not enough, but something has been learned. The pattern does not disappear when recognized. This is the thing. Recognition is necessary, and it is genuinely not enough. You can know the pattern completely, name it, trace its genealogy through 3 divine generations, describe its mechanism with precision, and still find yourself inside it, still find your hands doing the thing the pattern requires, because the pattern is structural. It is built into the architecture of how a being responds to threat, to intimacy, to the approach of the thing it fears most. Knowledge of the pattern and freedom from the pattern are 2 different locations, and the distance between them is not crossed by knowing. The mythology gives us 3 generations to show this, 3 rulers who feared the same thing, dressed in different clothes, at different scales, with different weapons and different children and different outcomes that were all, at the structural level, the same outcome. Uranus falling, Kronos rising and falling, Zeus rising, and then, and here the mythology gets complicated, gets human, gets interesting, bending, swallowing Metis, yes, but producing Athena from his own skull, the goddess of wisdom born from the act of containing wisdom, which is strange and which might be the pattern finally generating something from itself rather than simply repeating. Or it might be wishful thinking. The mythology allows for both. What I know, sitting here with this story finally at its end, what I know is that Kronos took the sickle because his mother asked him to, and he was the only one who answered. He built the best world. He swallowed his children to preserve it and lost it anyway. He was swallowed by the same logic he had set in motion, by the cycle he had perpetuated, by the curse that was accurate description more than punishment. He held on past the moment of letting go. The god of knowing when to cut could not read his own field. The stone sits at Delphi. The candles go up in December. The table gets wider, briefly, once a year. The harvest god, the one who knew when the moment had arrived. He didn't know it was his. Kronos knew the prophecy. He had been told in explicit words by the father he had wounded. Your children will do this to you. He had more information about what was coming than most human beings ever receive, about the patterns they carry. He knew, and still the swallowing, still the same mechanism applied inward, applied to his own children rather than someone else's. The knowledge did not interrupt the cycle. The knowledge was completely present and completely insufficient. What interrupted it, began to interrupt it, because the cycle did not end cleanly. The cycle never ends cleanly, was the stone. Rhea's plan. The specific act of putting something between the fearful ruler and the thing the fearful ruler needed to consume. Something that could absorb the swallowing without being destroyed by it. The stone is not a trick. The stone is the first time in this entire mythological cycle that the mechanism skipped a beat, that the gear failed to engage, that what was supposed to be devoured was somewhere else when the devouring happened. Growing in the dark in a cave in Crete, becoming the thing that could change things. Every generation, the mythology is suggesting, gets the chance at its own stone, its own interruption, its own moment when the thing marked for consumption is hidden somewhere the consuming cannot reach, protected by someone who loves it enough to lie for it, nurtured in secret until it is strong enough to emerge. The question is always whether the protection holds long enough. Let me collect the thread here, because the ending is close and I want to be careful with it. There is a God at the edge of the world tonight, or at the bottom of the abyss. The sources disagree, and the disagreement is, I think, the most honest thing about him. The mythology cannot settle on what he deserves, which means the mythology understood something true about him. He was harvester and tyrant, terrified father, and the architect of the world's best age, the perpetuator of the worst pattern his line produced. All of this at once, without the resolution that would make it comfortable to hold. You have been carrying something like that tonight, I think. Not a god, nothing that enormous, but the specific feeling of holding something that is simultaneously good and terrible, or was both at different times, or is both in different ways, depending on who is describing it. The parent who loved too tightly. The period of your life that was golden and fearful at the same time. The thing you built or were given that protected and confined in the same gesture. The love that was also the grip. The harvest that was also the holding on past harvest. We are all, in some way, Kronos, and we are all the children in the belly, and we are all somewhere the stone that sits in the dark absorbing what was aimed at something else. And in the best of our moments, the moments that are rarest and cost the most, we are the one who goes down into Tartarus and feeds what has been imprisoned and asks for its help. The question is which one you are right now, tonight, in this particular season. The breath is slower now. I can feel it. In whatever imagined version of this conversation I have access to. The breath of someone who has traveled a long way through a long story and arrived somewhere quieter than where they started. I want to ask you something and then leave it without answering it, which is the only honest thing you can do with this kind of question. Did Kronos know? The prophecy he knew. The prophecy was explicit, delivered at point-blank range, no ambiguity. But in the moment of each swallowing, in those 5 specific moments when a newborn was placed in his hands and he looked at it, he must have looked at it some interval of looking, however brief. Was there recognition? Was there grief? Was there that specific terrible clarity that sometimes arrives in the center of the worst things we do? The clarity that says, I know this is wrong. I understand the cost. I am doing it anyway because I do not know how to stop being what I am. And if there was, does it matter? Does knowing make it better or worse? Is knowing the thing that could have changed it? Or is knowing precisely what could not change it? Because between knowing and changing lies the entire distance between where we are and where we want to be. Anyway, I don't know. I'm leaving the question in the room, in the space between your last thought and whatever comes next. It is old enough to keep its own company. It has been sitting in this story for 3,000 years. It can sit here for one night without requiring anything from you. Let it be unresolved. That is how the best questions spend their nights. The room is quieter than when we started. You are heavier than you were. Not with weight that presses, but weight that belongs. Weight that has settled into the body the way sediment settles in still water, slowly, finding where it can rest. The ceiling is doing its job. Your hands have nothing left to hold. The Saturnalia candles went out across the centuries, but the memory they were lit to honor persists. In every December light, in every year-end table opened wider than usual, in every cold month gesture of sharing what you have, in every moment when the served and the serving briefly, temporarily, impermanently trade places, and everyone in the room feels something that their ordinary year has no word for. The candles went out. What they remembered is still there. That is what Kronos left in the world. Not the swallowing, which is what the cautionary tale version of him leaves, but this, the memory of when the abundance was general, the stubborn, irrational, genuinely beautiful refusal to stop believing it could be general again. He was more than the mistake. I want to say that plainly before the story closes. He was the full thing. The complicated, devastating, sometimes beautiful full thing that the mythology keeps trying to compress into a symbol or a lesson, and that keeps refusing compression. He was also the harvest. He was also the golden age. He was also the one who stepped forward when his mother was in pain and 11 others looked away. He was the complicated, irreducible, infuriating full thing. The pattern traveled forward. It always does. Uranus' sphere into Kronos. Kronos' sphere into Zeus, who swallowed Metis and produced Athena screaming from his skull, fully armed, born from the act of containing wisdom, which is strange, which is maybe the pattern finally generating something from itself rather than simply repeating. Or it is wishful thinking. The mythology allows for both. Something changes. Not enough, not cleanly. The wound travels forward in slightly altered shapes, generation by generation, until one day, not today, maybe not for many generations, something that looks like healing becomes possible. The story is almost at rest now. Let me say what I came here to say. We started tonight. A long time ago, it feels like. With one thing I asked you to hold, not analyze, not argue with. Just hold, loosely, the way you carry a stone in a coat pocket without meaning to. And the whole story has been turning around it, orbiting it, pressing on it from every direction to see if it holds. Kronos was the god of the ending of things. Ending, real ending. The ending the sickle accomplishes is the moment when what has grown to fullness in one form is taken into the next, released from the ground that produced it, freed into whatever it becomes when it is no longer what it was. The grain becomes bread. The bread becomes the winter that is survived. The survived winter becomes the spring that could not have come without the harvest. The ending is how the story continues. Whatever you are ending, whatever is ending around you, whatever season is tipping into the next, it is the space between sentences, the preparation, the between. The darkness holds what is becoming. The earth is still there, the same earth that pulled grey flint from her own body to make the first sickle, the same earth that held the cave in Crete where a hidden god opened his eyes, the same earth that is, right now, pressing gently upward against whatever surface you are resting on, doing the one thing it has always done without drama or condition or expectation of anything in return. Gaia is still holding everything up, and the desire, the ancient, unkillable, possibly most important thing about human beings, to make things a little better than you found them, to open the table wider, to light a candle when the dark is at its most complete. That is the inheritance of Kronos, the harvest part, the capacity to look at what has grown and understand that it is ready to be taken in, ready to feed what comes next, to hold the sickle as a tool in service of what you love, rather than a weapon against what you fear. That is what he was before the prophecy arrived, and the rain became organized around preventing the future, rather than participating in it. May you find your moments, the precise right moments when something that has grown fully in one form is ready to become what it feeds next. May the thing still growing be given time. May the stone do its work tonight in whatever form it takes in the architecture of your particular life, in whatever dark it keeps watching. The sickle is down. The season is turning. Good night.